I think it's inherent in being human that we want to, that being in relationship isn't like an added on extra. It's fundamental to who we are. The thing that needs explaining is someone who doesn't want to be in an intimate relationship, not someone who does. The notion of sacredness, it's the difference between a contract and a covenant. A contract is when two people agree on something for mutual benefit. And as long as both parties hold up their ends, they have a contract. And if somebody fails to do so, they're in breach of contract and the contract is broken. A covenant is something that, at least as I'm understanding it in the context of marriage, when you enter into marriage, it's what you said, a vow is sacred, which is to say you've taken it on as part of your identity. It's not merely that you thought it was a good idea to join forces with your wife, which I hope it is and was and may continue to be. It's also that that is part of now who you are. And that's what I'm talking about, that notion of saying, yeah, it's more than just the two of you now. You are now, that has become part of who you are. And it's interesting because you now interact with the world, not only as you. And I would expand that a little bit when you're talking about, what is the faith that you're expressing in terms of marriage? It's that faith, in addition to all the stuff about, yes, it's us together, and that feels good. There's also a piece of it that I think is associated with what would I call it? A little bit of humility, some respect for the fact that an institution that's been around in one form or another in pretty much any culture that any anthropologist has ever studied must have something to it.
Dr. Bruce Chalmer, after spending 3 decades deeply immersed in exploring human relationships, authoring multiple books on the subject, and co-hosting a podcast dedicated to this theme alongside your wife, Judy, with all that you have seen, what is it about human relationships and helping people with their relationships that you truly love?
What a great question. Wow. I guess one answer, I suppose this is maybe not as much of an answer as just a restatement of what you just said. I experience it as a calling. I did stuff, you mentioned 3 decades, and if people watching may be able to figure this out, and even if they're listening, I will tell them I'm 74 years old. So if you do the math there, I didn't get licensed to do this independently until I was in my mid 40s. I didn't start the training toward that until I was in my late 30s. So this was not something I did right out of college or even right out of graduate school. And the stuff I did before I enjoyed, I was good at, that kind of stuff. It wasn't until I actually experienced therapy myself, some good, some bad, frankly, but nevertheless experienced it, and found it like I felt the sense of calling. It felt like, wow, this is what I'm here to do. This feels really great. So what I love about doing it is that sense that it's not just that I feel like I've gotten pretty good at it over the years and I keep learning. I just feel very alive when I'm doing it. It feels like this is, I'm in the right place. I guess it's that sense. And I think anybody that finds that sense of feeling alive when you're doing what you're doing the right thing. So that's what I love about doing it.
Yeah, because I looked a little bit into your past as part of the research for this conversation, and you got, I believe, your master's in statistics at the University of Vermont in 1978.
Mm-hmm.
But after that, shortly after that even, you got your PhD in psychology also at the University of Vermont. So before, actually, that's where I think that's where this started, right? So when you got your PhD in psychology, that's when you started delving into human relationships. Have I got that right?
Not exactly. There's a connection, but not exactly.
Okay.
Because my PhD at the University of Vermont was on the research side. The connection between that master's in statistics and the PhD program was at the University of Vermont, they didn't have at that time a PhD program in statistics. It was an interdisciplinary program. But the people, I had done my master's work actually with the psych department, studying a pretty psychological topic. My master's thesis was on measuring quality of life in patients with advanced cancer, because they were doing some studies to see if certain interventions would improve people's quality of life when they had what ended up being terminal cancer. And they had to measure it somehow to do that kind of research. And so I did some research on that as part of my statistics program.
Right.
And then I wanted to go on and get a PhD and, learn more. The psych department people said, well, just come do it with us. You can do it with the research side. We'll take all your credits from your master's because you would need those things anyway. So ironically, then I had to take a bunch of psychology courses that I had never taken to get a PhD that was really much more about statistics than it was about psychology.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until about, well, how many years later? I don't know, 15 years later or so, that I actually started getting interested in clinical work. And so I got the clinical training after my PhD. It so happened that in the state of Vermont, that I'm in the United States, in that state, my PhD was old enough that I could go on and get a licensed psychology. I needed the training, of course, that just ethically I needed the training, but I didn't need to go back and retake courses so that it would be a clinical degree because my degree was, predated the licensing law in this state. So it just meant that I was able to get licensed. Of course, I got all the training that anybody ever gets. I just didn't do it as part of my PhD program.
Mm-hmm. And just to get my definition straight, because when I looked you up, you come forward right now as somebody who focuses on couples therapy.
Yes.
Is there a definition? Is there a difference between couples therapy and relationship therapy, or is that just the same thing?
In my mind, those are completely synonymous.
Okay.
And even marriage therapy or marriage counseling, all of those things. I mean, it makes a difference if you're married or not in terms of your life. That does have significant effects. But in terms of how I do the work, it doesn't make any difference. And I'll tell you another one at the risk of getting slightly in trouble with the powers that be. In the United States, there is this, all over the world, there is this concept of coaching, which is not the same as therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it not the same as therapy? Well, because therapy is regulated and coaching is not.
Mm-hmm.
And so people fall all over themselves trying to define, well, here's the difference between coaching and therapy. There is no difference between coaching and therapy. You are talking to a human being who's trying to help you with something. Now, what am I supposed to do? If I'm doing coaching instead of therapy, am I supposed to say, well, I can't think those helpful thoughts. Those are therapy thoughts. I have to only think these other thoughts, which are coaching thoughts. There is absolutely no difference in the conversations I have with people.
Right.
Now, if I were administering medication, which I can't do because I'm not trained, I'm not a MD. If I were administering medication, I could see, oh yeah, that's a difference. There's a difference between psychiatrists and all the other people who do various forms of, counseling or therapy or whatever, because they can actually administer medication, prescribe medication, which I can't do. That's a difference. But there is, in fact, no difference between coaching and therapy. And now I'm going public with that, so God knows what the regulators will say. But, people claim there is, and it's nonsense. They're just making it up.
Yeah. And just to be absolutely clear, because I think that if you are, for example, a clinical psychologist and you are licensed, you are, if that is your field at least, you can label people with a certain condition. You can label them, for example, with bipolar disorder or something along those lines. And if you're coaching, that is off limits, right? Then you are not allowed to do that.
I suppose you're not allowed to, although what does it mean to say you're labeling someone? You can suggest, hey, I think maybe this diagnosis would be useful to you or something. Mm-hmm. And what ramifications that has, the difference again, and this is kind of varies actually, certainly country by country. I'm not sure about other countries, but in the United States, varies even state by state. I can assign any diagnosis I want to, whether that has any actual effect on anybody. Indeed, I need a license for somebody to take a diagnosis I give and get that paid for by insurance. That requires a license. So if I were just doing coaching and I said, gee, I think you have bipolar disorder. Well, it's a great example though. If I say, gee, you might have bipolar disorder, I think you better talk to a psychiatrist who can prescribe some medication for you. Mm-hmm. Right before we got on, I was mentioning that I'd listened to the interview you did with Alison Greco and really enjoyed that. And that was one of the things she pointed out, that if you have a diagnosis, the original idea of the diagnoses in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, was to guide treatment. If you get the right diagnosis, a differential diagnosis will point you toward what one hopes is helpful treatment. And if I'm not licensed, then my suggesting that somebody might have a certain diagnosis doesn't really make much, it doesn't make much practical difference, except that maybe it'll get them to go to somebody who can get them the right medication or get them the right treatment or something like that, or get insurance to pay for it or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And just to get a very clear picture on what a relationship therapist focuses on. Mm-hmm. So before we delve actually into the meat of the conversation.
Sure.
Is it generally that you focus on couples as a unit? So do couples step into your door, or can it also be individuals?
Generally, it's couples, and it's
Hmm.
interesting. I didn't used to only do couples therapy. I've done couples therapy the whole time I've been in practice, but and that
Hmm.
was part of my training. But I also worked a lot with individuals. Did a lot of work with individuals actually recovering from trauma. So among other things, I got trained in EMDR, if you've heard of that, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a technique for helping people with trauma. I got trained in clinical hypnosis along the way. I learned a bunch of other stuff. So I used to do a lot of work with individuals. Even when I was working with individuals, and this isn't about the training, this is sort of a personal orientation toward it. I've always felt a responsibility to a larger system than just the individual I'm talking to. So if I'm talking to someone, even with when I was just working with an individual and never met their family, I still felt a kind of responsibility to their family and to the community as a lot, at whole, as a lot at large. There's the word. So folks may not realize this because it was before you started recording, but I kind of ran in here because I had spaced out the time, and I thank you again for being so understanding of that because I just kind of blew it. But if I seem a little bit mixed up, that's
Yeah.
why. Um, so that when I got transitioned more and more into working with couples because I just love that. There's something so immediate about working with a couple. But even, as I say, even when I was working with individuals, I was kind of thinking in larger systems. When I'm working with a couple, I almost always meet the two of them together. But occasionally there will be a reason when one or the other or both would say, let's have some individual work, individual sessions. But even then, I'm still doing couples therapy. So even if I'm working with an individual as part of a couple, it's still in a couple's context. And the practicality of that is simply that I tell people up front, I make them make sure they understand if there, I won't hold any secrets from one from the other. So if somebody came in an individual session when I'm working with a couple and said, hey, don't tell my wife, but I'm having an affair, I wouldn't call up his wife, not that. But what I would do is say, well, I can't have another meeting with your wife until you tell her.
Hmm.
I can't sit there and know something that's, significant like that you don't know. It's not like I have to go over everything that was ever said in an individual session, but they have to know I just can't. They have to be able to trust that I'm on both their side.
Hmm.
I'm not on either of their sides, and I'm not neutral either. I'm not on a side really. I'm with them against whatever problems they're dealing with.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a little bit early in the conversation to make an actual analysis of what drives you towards it. But I've listened, like we discussed before pressing the record button, that I listened to a bunch of your podcasts and also read some of your
Mhm.
work. And what seems to be coming forward, that's at least the feeling that I'm getting. So correct me if I'm wrong, is that you as a person you seem to really value, for example, the institution of marriage and good relationships and being in a real partnership with your significant other to really help each other grow. Let's say, which might actually be a definition of what love is to begin with, right? Helping each other grow. It's a
Absolutely.
definition.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that seems to be coming forward. And just to tie these two together, because in the beginning of the conversation you said, I had a calling to do this. Is that
Hmm.
calling because you would like to, because you love to share that idea, that love for marriage, that love for good partnership, and make sure that others can also enjoy that? Is that specifically that calling that you're talking about?
Boy, that's a lovely. You're good at this. That's a lovely way of summarizing it. I hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms, but yeah, that is very much. I think I don't think I'd put it in those terms before, but that's very much what that calling feels like. Yeah, when you say I have a deep respect for the institution of marriage, I know marriage doesn't work for everybody, so it's not like I'm saying, oh, you
Mhm.
have to be married to be okay. But nevertheless, I do consider monogamy in general and marriage specifically, and those are related but two different topics. Both of those as really, if you're into it, they're incredible gifts. They're not restrictions, they're gifts. And I really do love that and respect that. And so I find it really inspiring to help people with that. Because, when people are consulting me, occasionally they're consulting me to help split up. And I've helped people with that. And I'm happy to help people. I'm not happy, I'm willing to, to do that for
Yeah.
them. It's
Hmm.
a noble thing to do for people. But much more often, they're hoping they can want to stay together. I will often, usually in the beginning, I won't say, do you want to stay together? I will say, well, do you want to stay together? Because if they're
Right.
having
Yeah.
enough problems, they're realizing, well, I don't want to, I don't want to consign anyone to misery. I don't want to say, well, you have to stay together because you're married, or you have to stay together because of the kids or whatever, even though those are not terrible reasons to stay together, but not if you're miserable. I do recognize divorce is a necessary thing to have as a safety valve. And there are couples that need a divorce. And and I tell this to folks too. I am the marriage I have with Judy Alexander that you see in our podcast, that we've been married for 21 years. If you do the math on that, I was already in my 50s. She was in her late 40s. And so we're both second marriages. And actually, I think learned a lot from that. So it's not like I think divorce is always the wrong thing to do. Sometimes it's a
Mhm.
necessary thing to do. But yes, absolutely. The way you put that, I think, is really beautiful. That's very much part of the calling. It feels, when you can heal a couple, you're doing a little bit of healing of the world. It's not because all relationships have to work out. When I
Mm.
say heal a couple, I would even include those couples I mentioned sometimes that I help split up. That's healing too. So, when you heal people so that they come through hard times and come out feeling like, wow, you know what they will often say? They will often express gratitude, whether they stay together or not, much more often when they stay together, of course. They'll express gratitude for the crisis. And I relate to that personally because I felt the same way when I got through my first marriage and realized, that, actually, I can tell the short story of my first marriage. I don't think my ex minds. The short story of my first marriage is that both my ex and I have gone on to marry really wonderful women, and we're both a lot happier. That's basically how that turned out. And I really like my ex's wife, and we all get along fine. Um, but that's it turned out I was playing for the wrong team. It took a long time to figure that out, but that's how that turned out. But that crisis, which is very painful, I don't mean to trivialize it. That crisis, I am so grateful for having learned from. I don't think I'd be doing the work I did if I hadn't gone through something like that. And so many of the couples I work with that go through these really difficult crises, infidelity and all sorts of other betrayals, the kind of stuff I wrote about in that book, we'll probably get into betrayal and forgiveness. The couples
Mhm.
that come through that and feel like, wow, it's possible to heal from something like that, they express gratitude for that.
Yeah. Let's talk about marriage as a concept, because I learned over time, and I'll explain a little bit later what I mean by that, but I learned over time what the value of actual marriage is. And I didn't see it. If you would ask me like 10, 15 years ago, I would not really see it yet. And granted, I'm 34, so what do I know? But
More than
it
you did when you were
feels,
24, right? Oh,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. But still, I think it's valid to say that it feels, and I think data can back this up in many ways. And actually, I have some statistics I'm going to share with you very, very shortly. But it feels like in today's society, there's a lot less value being placed on marriage as an institution.
Yes,
It seems like if we are getting married, we're getting married later. Um, but that's the I think the best case scenario, right? Because now the question is, do you get married at all?
yes.
Is that the step you're going to take? And there's more than enough people that I know personally that are in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s, maybe even older, and they have been together with a partner. So not necessarily alone; they've been together with a partner for decades.
Yeah, I've seen some of this, maybe some of the same statistics. I'm not sure what you've got there, but I
Hmm.
looked up some too in conjunction with writing one of my books a few years ago. And
Hmm.
in Europe, I think even more than the United States, but the United States, it's catching up. The proportion of women giving birth who are married is under half in at least parts of Europe, I think. I don't remember exactly which countries. And in the United States, it's close to half. And many of those women who are giving birth, not being married, are indeed with the father of the child. They're still coupled with the father of the child, but they've chosen not to get married.
Yeah.
So, and that trend, indeed, that's been the proportion of people in younger, like your generation more than mine. Far fewer folks in your age group get married than in mine.
Yeah, because specifically in Europe, so I'll share one piece of statistics that I found right before this conversation. So since 1964, which is actually the moment that they started collecting data on this, so that's where the data starts. Relative marriage rates have dropped by 50% from around 8 per thousand people per year to 4 per thousand people per year. And this is according to Eurostat, which is the statistical office of the European Union. And this downward trend was briefly interrupted a couple of times. So one time in 1989, 2000, 2007, and 2018, which is kind of around moments of financial crisis, right? With the dot-com bubble in 2000, and you had the financial crisis, of course, in 2007. And there was actually a very steep curve downwards, let's say, of almost 25% in COVID time.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of years ago.
Yeah, part of that was due to
recovered.
not necessarily always people not wanting to get married, but they're not being able to have a wedding. And so they would postpone getting married until they could have a wedding.
Yeah. We actually got married. During Corona time. So in 2021 in August. And back then in Netherlands, you still had to keep 1.5 meters distance. So there was like this concept of social distancing. And you weren't allowed to have big events. So, for example, a party with 30 people, not allowed, not going to happen. We did though, don't tell anybody. But that was a thing back then. Yeah.
I remember actually when my mother-in-law died early on, and we weren't sure if it was COVID or not. She was sick anyway, but we couldn't go to the funeral. It was they only allowed 10 people at the cemetery. And we were watching on Zoom before people really knew how to use Zoom. It was really very painful.
Yeah, it did a lot of harm. But back to the story of marriage. With all of this, right? What do you think drives this? Why are less people getting married? And if they get married older, like myself. And like I said just now, I started realizing it later on what the value of marriage is.
And I will be very curious, to hear you describe that, actually. I'm happy. If you like, I wrote a chapter in one of my books called Reigniting the Spark. I have a chapter called Why Get Married? And it addresses some of what you're just asking, like, why aren't people getting married? And I don't think that's, there's some reasons I think are fairly simple, and then I'm sure there's more complex reasons. The simple ones are, and some of this is kind of a bootstrapping process, I think. When I was your age or even younger, let's say when I was graduating high school, I was 17. I was 17 when I graduated high school. That era, that was in 1968. So, back in those times, there was still a large stigma socially in most socioeconomic groups. There was still a large stigma to have children without being married. Of course, people did it, but there was still a stigma, a social stigma. You never heard a celebrity talking about, she's pregnant with her partner, No, she was pregnant with her husband, and it just wouldn't have been publicized if she was pregnant without a husband. So that stigma still existed. Now, you could say that's kind of a chicken and egg problem, which caused which. Now there is virtually no stigma about that. Whatever, plenty of people do that. Plenty of celebrities do that. It's just not a problem. Legally, it was much more difficult to more or less simulate the legal protections of marriage than it is now. So for a long time, if you weren't someone's spouse, you couldn't necessarily visit them in the hospital. Hospitals have somewhat figured out how to get around that by letting you designate someone. You can designate people who could be your person as if they were your spouse. There are legal agreements, in the United States, there used to be substantial tax advantages to being married and the occasional tax disadvantage, actually, but mostly tax advantages. There are ways of simulating a lot of that stuff, too. So there's a lot of ways, the old advantages, the practical advantages of marriage are less so. People buy houses together when they're not married. You didn't used to be able to do that. So, women can get credit on their own now without being married. That wasn't true in the United States until the 1970s. So, there's been a lot of progress with respect to that kind of thing. So the necessity of getting marriage, well, and I'll actually speak to the same issue in terms of women. Women are capable of earning a living in ways that they were not capable of nearly as easily back in the 1960s, 70s, before then. The proportion of women, and now actually your generation, I don't know if this holds true outside the United States. Your generation is the first generation where women as a group, trying to think, is it only women with college degrees or no? I think it's women as a group are earning more than men. That was never true since anybody ever started keeping statistics about that sort of thing. So women are able to, women don't have to be married to be able to not be poor. So that's another reason why marriage, the necessity of marriage is far less than it used to be. So there's that. Then there's the flip side, which is, I mean, the negative side of why people don't get married, which is marriage often looks like a shit show. They'll, again, I'm old enough to remember when there were very few grounds for divorce, and that was liberalized back in the 1970s in the United States. Again, I'm not quite sure about various European countries have done that.
Mm-hmm.
But when it was liberalized, there was this huge spike in divorces, which I would tend to think of was pretty much, a pent-up demand. There were all these bad marriages where it was almost impossible to divorce until they changed the divorce laws to make it much more possible. And then all of a sudden, all these people wanted to get divorced. So the people who grew up from the 1970s on were seeing enormously increased divorce rates. And so a lot of the people in your generation and even somewhat older, people in their 40s and 50s even, grew up with divorced parents, grew up with parents, where they saw a similar thing. They see people getting married, they see it go to hell, and they don't want any part of it. And I hear this fairly often from couples that I'm seeing if they're not married. They will, because I'll often ask us, like, what are your thoughts about marriages? And one of the things that often happens with couples is one of them, in a heterosexual couple, it's almost always the woman, not always, but almost always the woman who's wanting to get married. And the other one, more often the man, is saying, no, I don't want to. And often his reason is, I see people get married and it seemed like they had a good relationship and it just went down the tubes. So those are other reasons why I think people avoid marriage, because they see that it seems to be associated with bad outcomes. So, that's a bunch
Yeah.
of reasons. But, I do have what I wrote about in that chapter I mentioned. I have a sense of, if someone asks me, why should anybody get married? I don't think everybody should get married because there are people who don't want that. I get that. But what difference does it make if you're married or not? For people who like monogamy and like lifetime, the notion of lifetime partnership, they're dedicated. They want themselves to be a unit, that kind of joining together, economically and emotionally and sexually in whatever ways. Why should they get married? What difference does it make to get married? And what I point out is, and this is independently of whether you're religious or not religious, what I point out is when you get married, the difference between being married and not, because as obviously marriage doesn't guarantee anything. It doesn't guarantee you're going to stay
Mm-hmm.
together. It doesn't guarantee you're going to be
Mm-hmm.
faithful. It doesn't guarantee anything. Why get married? Well, because when you get married, you're doing something that isn't even about the two of you. It's actually about a wider system. Now, religious people would say, yes, you're getting married before God, if they're one of the Western religions. Even whether or not you're religious, you're getting married before your community. You're getting married in the eyes of the state, that's another thing I've heard from folks who don't want to. Why should the state have anything to do with it? Well, yeah, I get that it can feel kind of icky for the state to have a piece of it, except that that's a representation of the fact that the whole community has a piece of it. And Judy and I are Jewish, and in Jewish tradition, I don't know if you're familiar with what a chuppah is. And have you ever
No,
been to a Jewish wedding, or maybe
I
you've
have
seen
not.
it? If
No,
haven't seen Fiddler on the Roof, doesn't matter.
also not. No.
Fine. No, the chuppah, it's a canopy. It means canopy, but
Mm-hmm.
the canopy that you're married under is open-sided. And that's part of the symbolism. And I could say it, and usually don't people say it this way because it sounds a little cynical. I don't mean it cynically. The open sides means, yeah, everybody's got a piece of you. It's no longer about you. You
Mm-hmm.
think you're going to bed with your partner? You're not. You're going to bed with the whole community. Everybody cares about what's going on in there, That's what it means to get married. If you don't get married, that doesn't happen the same way. On the other hand, people don't view you as a unit the same way either. So that's where I was coming from. But I am really curious, Jeffrey, what did you come to realize? Because I'm really curious about that.
While you were telling that story, something just came forward to me because it's interesting, right? There's this dynamic between between having the vision of an ideal marriage in mind, which a lot of people seem to have. It's like a very romanticized vision, right?
No.
Being married seems very romantic. But at the same time, the flip side is that we see a lot of marriages that fail and that end in misery pretty much. Even if, people can get divorced and get in trouble, but even people can also stay together and be in deep waters.
Oh, yes.
So, but still somehow marriage is being seen as this romantic ideal, and not just from a religious context. I think that is true in general. And what I'm curious about is, okay, maybe I'm not sure if what I'm about to say is technically true, but if we agree, and I think it's pretty clear, that marriage rates are going down, right? And less people in their entire lifetimes will get married, and the ones that will get married will very likely get married later on. Why is marriage still being seen as this kind of romantic ideal to some degree? I think that's technically a true statement.
I think it is too by people who like it. They will see it that way. I want to note
Hmm.
when you say marriage rates are going down, the old statistician in me says, well, they had been going down, but that trend can turn around. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, whether that trend will eventually turn around. The underpopulation issue has been getting a lot more press here in this country and
Yeah,
probably in Europe as well, I imagine,
yeah, yeah.
and much of the world. I mean, in
Hmm.
Korea, it's like they're hardly having any babies, it seems like, in South Korea. So there's lots of places where that's going to start to create some social pressure to pair up and have babies earlier, which will probably drive up the marriage rate, I would imagine. Can't say for sure, but anyway, there's that. But having said that, yeah, why would people in this milieu in which the stigma isn't there anymore? Why would they still view marriage as this sort of romantic ideal? Um, what occurs to me in answering that, because it's the way I always like to think of this stuff, happens to be what I'm focusing on, especially in the next book I'm writing. When I talk about what is it that makes people want to stay together, and this is
Hmm.
certainly true, I think, of a marriage, but it's even true if it's a different kind of couple that doesn't happen to be married. Either way,
Hmm.
what is it that makes people want to stay together? Lots of ways of answering that, but my favorite way is to think of two sets of needs, both of which are important. I'm using that word needs carefully because, I could say I need something when really what I mean is I desire something. And I'm talking about, no, needs. If they're not sufficiently fulfilled, something, it doesn't work. If something dies, something, breaks. So
Hmm.
I call these two sets of needs stability and intimacy. And the reason I differentiate, and it relates to that notion of romantic ideal, I think, people will often focus on the notion of intimacy and forget about stability. But when they actually get together with someone and especially do something like having kids, stability becomes way more important in most people's eyes. It's like, okay, we need to have something we're not constantly worried about.
Hmm.
And so they will focus on stability. The chief skills of stability are all about keeping the anxiety level low. So, what is it that helps the stability? Well, what is it that destroys stability? Things that spike
Yeah,
your anxiety. Infidelity is a classic. Infidelity is
yeah,
incredibly destabilizing. Substance abuse of
yeah.
various kind, incredibly destabilizing. If somebody has like a serious mental illness, if they're crazy in some way, that can be really destabilizing. Um, all sorts of things can happen that can really threaten stability. So folks will try and focus on that stuff. Intimacy, and here I better define my terms, I mean it in a pretty broad sense. I'm not just talking about sex. Intimacy is when you are present and honest with yourself and each other. And you know what? That's usually how I say it. Another way of saying it, and it relates to what we were talking about earlier when you were talking about what is it, why do I love doing the work I do? What is it, this calling about?
Hmm.
It's about feeling alive. Intimacy is that feeling of being alive,
Hmm.
that you can be who you are in the presence of someone else being who they are and not freak the fuck out. I don't know what your language code is. Was it okay that I said that?
You're okay. You're
Okay,
good.
I thought so. I thought
You're
I'd heard
good.
that another way. Yeah, yeah. So that's the point. It's the chief
Hmm.
skills of intimacy are all about tolerating anxiety without freaking out. And that when you privilege stability, a lot of times what people will do is they will inadvertently compromise intimacy because they won't be honest. They won't complain about something they want to complain about because they're worried that's going to raise anxiety, especially if they've had the experience, as so often happens, of getting into a big argument when they bring up a complaint. And they feel terrible. They just, they've just been trained. Don't do that. Don't bring up something. Better avoid bringing up something. So they start walking on eggshells. And it's not just complaints. It's things like fantasies or dreams or, what if you want to say to your partner, in the sexual domain, fantasies is a great example. What if you want to say to your partner, gee, I've been thinking about trying something we've never done or play acting something we've never done, and I'm worried you're going to think I'm weird. So they don't say it. And they kind of shut off part of themselves. And over time, they start to feel the opposite of feeling alive. They start to feel dead.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happens, my whole thesis is when I say both stability and intimacy are needs, if stability isn't there, you're just constantly in a panic. But if intimacy isn't there, that becomes destabilizing. What happens is we can't tolerate that. My favorite metaphor that I'm always quoting to people, and I've written in several of my books, my favorite metaphor there is if you think about a seed that, say, falls from a tree, into the soil, and it starts to, germinates and sprouts and starts to grow. Then someone comes along and they pave a sidewalk over it.
Mm-hmm.
And why would they pave a sidewalk over it? Well, because it's more stable to walk on. That's in the service of stability. What is that seed going to do? Well, it's not just going to sit there. It's going to try and crack the sidewalk, or it will die trying. And intimacy is what I'm referring to in that metaphor is, stability is provided by the roots, but intimacy is the energy for growth. And, I say it's a metaphor. I've been talking about this recently with various people, and I tend to think it's almost literal. I think the energy for growth is kind of what I mean by intimacy. That sense that you want to reach out and be who you are and interact with your environment. That's what we all want to do, and more than want to do. It's what we all need to do on some level.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't happen, what happens with a couple if intimacy is compromised is they metaphorically crack the sidewalk. What does cracking the sidewalk look like? Well, that can look like an affair. It's not the only reason people have affairs, but it's one of them. It's certainly the biggest reason people have affairs when they come to see me is something like that. And there's been some breach of intimacy and somebody becomes vulnerable to getting it somewhere else. And again, not just sex, but that sense that they feel starved for that. But even couples that don't have affairs, sometimes it could be that they end up arguing about everything and nothing. And they will say that. They say, we get into arguments over trivia. And yet everything. And as soon as we do that, everything we've ever argued about for the last 5 years comes out. Or they will say, we end up arguing about how we're arguing. We'll end up arguing about our tone of voice, which is kind of, I mean, if it weren't so painful, it would be funny. It's absurd. But they will often, and they'll realize that, but they'll often do that. Everything will be an argument. The one thing they won't argue about is what they really need to figure out, because that's too scary.
Yeah, it's this whole idea of not fixing your fundamental problems, letting them stay there. It's like a dragon that grows over time, right?
Yeah.
And instead of killing the dragon, instead of doing something about it, this is also, I think, the idea of. I heard this somewhere. So, if you don't like it that your partner, for example, leaves the dishes on the table, right, without cleaning them up, the ideal thing to do is to have a discussion about that and to fix that behavior. But if you leave that there over the course of 20 years, that's 20 years every day that you're dealing with a frustration, even though it's just for a couple of minutes, but that's days worth of time of frustration building up over time.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of doing something about it, now all of a sudden it's this big problem that you have to deal with. And it's like all these different things combined that make people not stand each other anymore.
You know what? The metaphor that occurs to me is I have my favorite stock of metaphors. I tell people I'm like a bad Borscht Belt comic. I'm not sure if you get the expression Borscht Belt, but it's a thing in the United States where all the Jewish people in New York, not all, many of the Jewish people in New York would go to the Catskills for during summer. The wives and children would go out there and the husbands would come out on weekends and they would have these comics. Some of the famous comics of the 1950s and 60s and even before then got their start on the Borscht Belt. So anyway, I'm like a bad Borscht Belt comic because I got my shticks. I've got the very shticks that I have. One of my shticks, and I did not invent this.
Gotcha.
Is the emotional bank account. That notion of an emotional bank account, what you just described is a great example of that. Because think about a checking account. Again, I'm not sure how they work in Europe, but they're probably pretty similar to how they work in this country. If you write a check and you don't have enough funds to cover it, what happens? Well, the The idiom we use in English is it's a rubber check. It bounces, so the check bounces. Now you pissed off the person you wrote the check to, of course, because they're not going to get paid. But it's worse than that, because if you write a check and there's insufficient funds, the bank hits you with an overdraft fee. So you're now more in the hole than you even were before you wrote the check. So a couple that has, if you think about an emotional bank account, every time you have a pleasant interaction, every time you enjoy each other's company, every time your heart lifts when you're in the other person's presence, you've made a nice deposit in the emotional bank account. If you have a nice big balance in there and then somebody does something annoying, there's plenty of room for it.
Doesn't
No
matter.
problem.
Yeah.
And of course, that is another one of my favorite theses. In fact, my wife and I did a podcast on this, I think a few months ago. And it's just like what almost I did to you. We were set to do a podcast with a guest and the guest didn't show. They had a better excuse than I did, by the way, incidentally. I just blew it. This one, they had a family emergency, that's like somebody was in the hospital or something. But anyway, they didn't show. So we're sitting there, think, well, we want to do a podcast. So I said to Judy, I said, hey, I know, let's do a podcast about the one skill that solves all relationship problems. And she looked at me like, oh, really? Like, sure.
Can I guess?
Please.
Communication?
No, it's an interesting idea. Did you say fornication? No, what did you say?
No, communication.
There was a glitch in, that's hilarious. There was a glitch in the on the connection there, and I heard the occasion. I think fornication. No, that wouldn't. No. Actually, I'll tell you about my book about. It's not about communication. That's the title of one of my books. Actually, we'll get to that later. But no, it's sillier than that. It's the ability to be moderately annoyed. I think I said mildly annoyed first. I've since changed it to moderately. It has to be more than mildly. The ability to be
more intense over time.
Yeah, well, the ability to be moderately annoyed. Because if you think about it, moderately annoyed as opposed to what? As opposed to totally freaking out. Because the one I claim as a constant, I don't like to make these sweeping generalizations, but I'm really confident about this one. You and I and everybody we know are all annoying. Right? We are human beings. Therefore, it's like Descartes, I am human. Therefore, I'm annoying, not only annoying. Don't get me wrong. I'm not cynical. I'm not saying, oh, humans are terrible. I'm just saying we're all annoying. My God, I know I'm way more annoying than my wife is. She is far less annoying than I am. It is good that I think that, by the way, that I always often give that tip, especially to men and, married to women. It's like, good tip. Just figure you're more annoying than she is. A lot goes better if you just assume that, and
a lot of wisdom in that.
I think there is. But anyway, and the reason one of the reasons we get along is she's very gracious about me being annoying. She either laughs it off, she'll mention it, if she doesn't like it, she'll mention it, and I will try and not, I'm not trying to say I have carte blanche to be as annoying as I want just because I know that. I'm just observing that it is the human condition to annoy other people sometimes. So that phenomenon, getting back to the emotional bank account, there will be withdrawals from the account, right? I'm going to be annoying to my wife on occasion. And if we have enough balance in there, she will smile rather than get really angry. She might mention it if it's worth mentioning, she'll mention it. Interestingly, when you have a nice balance in the account, stuff that would otherwise be way annoying, often it doesn't cause a withdrawal. It's like, it's irrelevant. It's like, well, I know, so you occasionally leave the dishes. Who cares? I don't care. I so appreciate your existence that I don't mind that you leave a dish on the table occasionally. Do you know what I mean? That can work only if you have a nice balance in the account. And the problem is, and this again relates to your example, the problem is if you're overdrawn, if you're always on the edge of irritation, if being in each other's presence is already painful, then any small thing like, oh, there he goes leaving the damn dish again, anything becomes yet more evidence for why things are bad.
Yeah.
And that's, again, like hitting you with the overdraft fee. It's like worse than it was. It wasn't just about leaving the dish anymore. It's about leaving yet another dish, like we always had this problem, and all the other things that are bothering me all come out at the same time. So that's the problem with not having, a sufficient balance there. And that's, it's ironic sometimes because it's funny. I just had this conversation with a couple of days ago. I just met them for the first session, and it was similar things like this that they were dealing with, sort of a breakdown in intimacy, and their balance was low, and they found it a really useful way of understanding it. But they were saying, well, how do we get out of this? Because we're so able to be irritated by each other. And the irony is, and I pointed out, it's not like this is an easy solution for you. You kind of have to already be better to get out of it. Do you know what I mean? You have to
Mhm.
already not be so upset with each other so that those same things won't upset you anymore. And then you can start to build a balance because you won't be constantly making withdrawals, and you're able to start building up the balance again, start feeling like, oh, I actually do like being around you. But that's hard to get to.
Yeah. And I think this ties a little bit into the question that you asked earlier, when I was talking about how I learned over time what the value of marriage is. Because for me, like one of the things I think is typical for Dutch people is they are very down to earth, let's say, right? And the Dutch have also a stereotype of being cheap asses, and marriages are not cheap, so that might also play a role there.
I have
But
heard that stereotype, I will note. Not, I don't believe it, but I've heard it.
well, we know how to strike a deal, that's for sure.
Mhm.
But for me, in my personal experience, I didn't really see the value of marriage that much. Um, when I was 20, maybe 24, 25 or something like that. And it was for a couple of reasons. And if I just recall them right now, I think it was more a financial reason. So, marriages are not cheap again. You have to do them well. I think if you get married, at least that's how I look at it. But they didn't provide much. So back then, in my mind, they didn't provide much actual value, right? They provided you being legally connected to a person, which made sure, for example, here in Netherlands, that means that you that the property that you own, that the wealth that you have, it becomes 50-50, right? 50% is owned by the other person that you marry. I didn't see much more value in that. But over time, I learned, and this was also partially due to my wife, who comes from Poland. And Poland is a more traditional country. So in Poland, the institution of marriage is a lot more valued than I think it is here in the more western side of the continent, let's say, and also in the United States maybe. She liked the idea of getting married, and I was like, not really that interesting. But over time, I learned, okay, well, a couple of things. One, if it is important to you, per definition, needs to be important to me, because else I'm ignoring you, right? Two, you mentioned trying to be your best self. And if I'm taking away something that you enjoy, that means we can never be our optimal self. There's a wrench over there that needs to be resolved. That's not good. But three, and this is more the philosophical exploration that I was going through. I started reading a lot of let's call self-help books, but also philosophy books, and having this podcast is an extension of that. Right, I really enjoy delving into people's ideas, people's philosophies, and figuring out what's right and what people think and why they think it. And by doing that, I learned that I learned not necessarily what marriage technically means, but what it symbolizes, right? And I learned that, for example, saying that vow, right, that you will support your significant other in good and in bad times, I feel, and this is my personal opinion, that people don't take their vows very seriously all the time. They say it because it's standard for marriage, but it's not sacred. It feels like it's not sacred.
Yeah.
And I learned over time that they should be, right? That if you say, in this case, I will support you in good and in bad times, that means you will be there,
Yeah.
right? And if your relationship doesn't go well because you're running into a fundamental issue, and I think everybody has encountered that in their relationship, including myself, that doesn't mean you take the plug out and just run for the hills.
Mhm.
It means you do whatever you can in order to solve your marriage, in order to save your marriage. And what I found, so when I spoke those words out, when I finally made on Halloween night, actually, I proposed to my wife, and
There's
we
a
got married
song.
on.
There's a song from the 1960s that talks about that, by the way, proposing on Halloween. That's
Yeah.
it's spooky. Look it up. It's called. I forgot the name of the artist from the
Uh,
1960s. Spooky. Yes.
it's a little bit of a theme because we both have a love for horror movies, and we both actually met through a video game which is horror focused,
Ah,
a
wow.
little game called Left 4 Dead. So it's kind of like a theme. So that's why Halloween evening became kind of a thing. But anyway, fast forward. When I spoke those words, to me personally, they felt sacred, right? There needs to be something insane happening that I can't even imagine. Infidelity might be one of them. That will break that, right? Because I hold them sacred. And I think that is the value of marriage. I think the value of marriage is not necessarily the legal unit together, or the fact that you share property or share ownership over your net value or whatever. But I think it's establishing a permanent partnership, relationship, but also a foundation. So knowing in the back of your mind that whatever happens and whatever trouble you're running into, you have someone there in your corner that is there unconditionally. And that requires far more than just a ring, obviously. That requires a lot of trust and a lot of discussion and a lot of really getting to know each other and a lot of soul searching. So it requires way more than just marriage. But to me, marriage is the symbolization of that in its perfect form, let's say. And that's what I learned over time. So that's why we went for it.
That fits. I mean, it's often easy to do this. It's like I'll take something and say, "Oh, that fits with fits with what I was saying." I think that actually fits quite well. The notion of sacredness. There's a distinction I think I make in one of the books, and I've heard other people make this too. And it's sort of religious terminology, but it doesn't have to be religious. It's the difference between a contract and a covenant. Are you familiar with those terms? So at
Mhm.
least the way I'm using it, I'm not sure this is the standard way of saying it, but a contract is when two people agree on something for mutual benefit.
Mhm.
And as long as both parties hold up their ends, they have a contract. And if somebody fails to do so, they're in breach of contract and the contract is broken.
Yeah.
And that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. In business, you have contracts and there are consequences for breaking it and whatever.
Yep.
So, and they can be legally enforced. A covenant is something that, at least as I'm understanding it in the context of marriage, when you enter into marriage, it's what you said, a vow is sacred, which is to say you've taken it on as part of your identity.
Right.
It's not merely that you thought it was a good idea to join forces with your wife, which I hope it is and was, and may continue to be. It's also that that is part of now who you are. And that's what I'm talking about, that notion of saying, yeah, it's more than just the two of you now. You are now, that has become part of who you are. And it's interesting because you now interact with the world, not only as you interact as you, and also you, and I think your wife's name is Kate. Did I see that?
Yep. Correct.
Is that,
Yep.
yes. Yeah. So you and Kate, whether she likes it or not, and I hope she likes it, you're representing her too, whether you like it or not. Do you know what I mean? That's
Yep.
part of what happens. And there are a lot of people who are afraid of that for, I think, pretty understandable reason. It's like, whoa, that's a level, I don't control that. It's not just me, it's me and Judy. I don't control that. And she doesn't either, and she's out there representing me too, and that's a huge level of trust. I'm far less worried about her embarrassing me than me embarrassing her, but that's because I'm more annoying, as previously indicated. But
Mhm.
but that phenomenon that you're entering into that as a change to your identity. That's what I mean by sacred. The notion of sacred. Actually, I have another chapter called "Sex, Good Sex, and Sacred Sex." I talk about sacred in the context of the sexual relationship. Sacredness implies that sense of being set apart. It's not like everything else. So when you enter into marriage, you are entering into territory that you have not been before, unless you've been married before.
Mhm.
You're changing your status in a really significant way. And so that it turns out to have very large effects. And often I have met folks, Matt, I don't know if you have too. I've met folks who are surprised. I bet people who've gotten married because they needed, in this country, they need health insurance.
Right.
We have a so-called healthcare system here
Mhm.
that, many of us look to Europe and say, why can't we be like you guys? But whatever. There's all kinds of reasons. Apparently we can't. Um, but, so people will get married for the health insurance, or so they can give their now spouse the health insurance. or they'll get married for some other sort of external reason. And then they're surprised that it feels different, or that other people start treating them different, or that they start to panic about it. All of those things can happen. And it's because it's often more significant than people even realize. But that's an
Yeah.
interesting way, you're recognizing the sense of sacredness. I will note, everything you said, I agree with. There, of course, there are circumstances where divorce, as I said earlier, and I imagine you agree with this, I don't know, where divorce is necessary. There are some circumstances where, oh my God, we've encountered something that we can't get past. Now, it's interesting. You were speculating a little bit when you said, well, maybe infidelity would be one of those things.
Hmm.
And there's many, many couples who haven't experienced it would often say that. And it's just fascinating to me the number of couples that I've worked with where in the first session they're sitting there and they're telling me about infidelity, which is roughly half the couples I deal with, I think. And that's a kind of a rough guess. Um, and one of them, one or the other, like the one who was cheated on, is saying, if you had asked me 6 months ago before I found out about this, would I be sitting in a therapist's office trying to save my marriage when my partner cheated on me? I would have said, no, there's no way, I'd be out of here. And yet there they are. So it's surprising how many people want to heal after infidelity, and indeed how many do. I don't have a statistic on that because, I don't keep that statistic because that's not how I measure success. I don't, success isn't always staying together,
Yeah.
and success isn't always agreed upon by the two parties either. That's another interesting phenomenon. But in terms of how many people actually do manage to recover, a couple can recover from something even as painful as infidelity. Pretty much the only way they're going to recover is if their relationship ends up better than it was before. Because where it was before was, it's, again, I'm not trying to shift the blame for doing a bad thing
Hmm.
away from the person who did it. It's not about that. But contextually speaking, where they were is what led to where they got. And so they don't want to go back to where they were because that didn't work.
A person who is naive on this subject, and maybe I am too, so again, correct me, but for as far as I know, a person who is naive on the subject might just look at infidelity as something pretty mundane and might say something along the lines of, okay, if infidelity happens within your relationship, then just, you just know that the person is not trustworthy and you can just get out of the relationship and, screw that person, go live your life.
Yeah.
But apparently it runs way deeper than that, because apparently if you are married to a person, right? Let's say somebody is married for 10 years, right? And they've been arguably together for way longer. But let's say they're married for 10 years. And in year 10, they figure out that they've been cheated upon. And it happened 5 years ago. So the person who has been cheated upon, in their mind, in their story of how their life looks like, they have been in a faithful, good, beautiful relationship for the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But then all of a sudden they figure out that that's not the case and that it happened 5 years ago. So apparently the destructive thing here on a psychological sense is the realization that the last 5 years were a lie.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden that opens obviously a can of worms, because now all of a sudden you can ask yourself the question, if this wasn't true, what else isn't true?
Yeah.
So all of a sudden your story, right, your narrative as a person, as a human, is worth nothing, right? It feels like you don't have control over your own life. And apparently it's that fact that is hugely traumatizing to people. It's that fact that gets people to never trust again or to land into depression or worse. Apparently it's, because of this reason, gigantically destructive.
Yeah. Yeah, that all sounds accurate to me. That now the interesting thing is that people can heal from that often. And heal together or separate.
Mm-hmm.
And, and a lot of the work I do in folks dealing with infidelity, again, whether they stay together or not, is to help them heal from all of that stuff you just said. It's interesting. I was, as you said, that story, I was thinking of a couple I worked with not long ago where it was almost, the numbers weren't exactly that, but almost that. It's like a couple had been married like 20 years and found out that 5 years ago he had an affair.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very much it was the man who had the affair, and the woman was going through very much the stuff you were describing. It's like, well, I thought for 5 years something was true that wasn't true. And that's incredibly painful. Yeah, trauma indeed, because all the stuff you said, she's not merely thinking, oh no, he's been terrible. She's thinking I must be crazy not to have seen this, or stupid, or wrong.
Hmm.
She can't trust her own judgment anymore. All of those things are true. The initial phases of finding out you've been cheated on are a lot about that stuff. It's a lot about getting past that shock. And, it's shock and it's grief and it's anger. It's all of the above. And one after another in whatever combination they happen to occur in a given moment. And so recovering from that, yeah, it takes, that's a lot of the early work is that. And what's interesting is when if I could sort of fast forward to look at when they've recovered from that. Now, it's not like it's all or nothing, but when they've done a lot of work and by whatever means, be it therapy or otherwise, when you look back on it, when you've healed from that kind of trauma, you look back on it and it's interesting because then they're able to look back on those 5 years that initially they were thinking, oh my God, it was all a lie, and realized, no, it wasn't. There was lying. That's bad. But it wasn't all a lie, actually. There was actually some good times in there. I find this same phenomenon. I mentioned earlier, I used to do a lot of work with people recovering from various kinds of trauma, PTSD type stuff. And very often when somebody was dealing with trauma that they experienced as a child, so they were, sexually abused by a parent or something like that, or, all sorts of traumas that can happen to people as kids. And I'm working with them as adults. And they're dealing with stuff that maybe for years when they were reminded of it, consciously or not, they would go into something of a panic or they would break down or, it was hugely painful. And they would work on that and they would process the trauma in such a way that they could say, I can think about it now. It was horrible, but I can think about it now and it doesn't get to me now because I realize it's not happening now. I realize I'm an adult now. I have power I didn't have then. I'm okay now. And then they can look back and say, I used to not be able to think about my childhood at all, or not be able to think about that period of time at all, or not be able to think about any time we ever spent with that particular uncle at all, whatever. Now I can look back and I can think about that stuff. It's like, yeah, there was the bad stuff in there, but there's also this other stuff that wasn't. They sort of get their life back. When people have processed the trauma of, let's say, infidelity, it's not only that they can be okay going forward, they actually get their past back as well. They don't have to be traumatized by the past. They can look at it with perspective. They can come to, really what they can end up doing if, when it goes well, is what I call forgiveness. And I didn't make up, this particular use of the word forgiveness, but forgiveness is that sense that says, I don't have to be angry at you about this anymore. It wasn't good. I don't condone it, but I can get past the anger and then we can figure out, all right, what do we do about trust, which is a whole different question. I can forgive somebody I don't trust. I can forgive somebody I have no intention of restoring a relationship with.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's forgiveness the way I'm using the term. And again, this is not I didn't make this up. Forgiveness is an inside job. It's like, no, my forgiveness is about getting the poison out of me, not about.
Yeah. So you can move on.
Yeah. So I can move on. Then I can figure out, all right, what do I want to do about this relationship? But if you're freaking out, it's very difficult or nearly impossible to wonder if you can trust somebody if you just freaked out whenever you think about them. So forgiveness is is a step in healing almost independently of what you want to do about the relationship. And that's, the book I wrote, Betrayal and Forgiveness. I write a lot about forgiveness, that sense of how do you get to forgiveness? And then you can figure out if you want to trust somebody. Forgiveness is more or less internal work. Trust is a two-way street. Trust has to involve both parties figuring out if they can trust each other.
Yeah. So you can forgive somebody without necessarily trusting that person again.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
My go-to example of this, I mentioned in one of my books, I think. It's a woman I met many years ago. I never met her ex-husband because he was in prison. Why was he in prison? Because he had been hugely violent to her and their children. He had put her in the hospital on several occasions. She had lied about it to the hospital people at first because he threatened to kill their children if she told the truth. And she finally was able, with incredible courage, she was able to work out an escape plan. And she got away and he was then charged with these crimes and he was in prison. But what was interesting so I was talking to her about other stuff. She had no intention of ever being in his presence. And again, in fact, she kept a gun that she would be willing to use if he showed up because she had no reason to believe that he would be safe. because he had threatened to kill her. He showed no remorse whatever. So but she said she forgave him. And she didn't mean she thought it was okay and she would, she could have coffee with him. She meant she doesn't have to be angry at him anymore. She just figured he's crazy, and that doesn't explain much, but it was a way of understanding. It's like, well, I don't have to blame him for it. I just have to recognize he's dangerous. It's sort of like, yeah, I'm not going to go hang out with a shark, when I have a bleeding cut. I'm not going to go hanging out with the shark because it's a shark. I don't have to blame the shark, but I'm going to get the hell out of there.
Yeah. So the argument there then is that her forgiving him is not necessarily to do him a favor, but it's allowing herself to let go of her hatred, still be very aware of what's happening, right? She was prepared if he showed up, but it's just to relieve her own mind, let's say, to not carry that hatred every single day anymore.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that's I consider that a really important way of understanding the concept of forgiveness, because if you use, people use the term forgive. All right, if I forgive you, that means it was okay. Or if I forgive you, that means I can forget about it. No, probably not. Not if it's something that is worthy of the term betrayal. Betrayal is a big word. Betrayal, a stranger can't betray you. They can hurt you, but they can't betray you. Betrayal is about the relationship. So betrayal is when somebody does something you never would have thought they would do based on your relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
That's why infidelity is a betrayal, between partners. It's, if a friend of mine cheats on his wife, he's not betraying me. I might think less of him, but he's not betraying me. He's betraying his wife. My relationship with him doesn't involve either of one of us being monogamous. I mean, it involves honesty between us, I suppose, but that's not a betrayal of me. To recover from that kind of betrayal implies you have to be able to get past, you're gonna have doubts about whether you can trust the person. You have to be able to get past the shock so that you can then think clearly about, all right, do you want to try and restore trust? And it's interesting what happens, again, infidelity being the most common example I deal with. It's interesting what happens when people can get to that point, when somebody can say, damn, you shouldn't have done that. I see, I get that you shouldn't have done that, but I can see why you did. You know what I mean? It's like, I can imagine a person I can consider to be a fundamentally decent person doing something like that. It's not right. I'm not saying it's just fine. I like to think I wouldn't do it, but I can understand you doing it. It's like, damn, given the situation, you were doing the best you could. That's, I talk about in the book about 3 steps to forgiveness. And of course, I like to point out, beware authors who say things like there are 3 steps to forgiveness, because that sounds so simple, doesn't it? But it's just a way of understanding it. Step 1, forgive yourself. And what I mean by forgive yourself is getting to the place where you say, damn, I guess I was doing the best I could given what I knew and what I didn't know. I'm not crazy, evil, or stupid. I just didn't know what I didn't know. And that's kind of the human condition. And if I'd known better, or even if I was in denial, it's like, well, I should have known. My friends were warning me. Yeah, I had reason to be in denial. I wish I weren't, but I was. I can forgive myself. That's what it means. That sense of, I'm not beating up on myself anymore. I was doing the best I could. Well, I can extend that to the one who hurt me. That's step 2. Forgive the person who hurt you. It's like, well, okay, I suppose that's what you came up with. Given who you were, given the forces involved, given whatever, nasty thoughts you had going, I guess that's what you did. I wish you hadn't, but I don't have to be angry and in shock about it anymore. I can accept that that's what happened. Now let's figure it out. And I do have a 3rd step that I love to point out, and you don't have to be religious to appreciate this. I call the 3rd step, forgive God.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by forgive God, again, you don't have to be religious to appreciate it. Forgive God means forgive the fact that shit like this can happen. Forgive the fact that we live in this universe where it feels like we're sort of in control of things a lot of the time. We do have power, we do have influence, but we don't have control to prevent ourselves from being hurt like this. It's
Yeah.
just the way it goes. And we have to accept that not only is that true, but the forgiveness part is saying, yeah, damn it, there's something right about it. I didn't listen to your whole podcast on this one, but you interviewed a philosopher about that very issue, the issue of, I think it was one of your most recent podcasts, goodwill and free will and good and evil,
Yeah. Evil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, the standard theological response to why would a good God let bad happen is free will. And makes sense. I mean, I get that. what I'm talking about in terms of forgiving God is more or less just accepting the basic rightness of that, even when you get hurt by it. It's like, well, shit, we're all free to do bad stuff. I got badly hurt by it, but we, if I were running the universe, I would not do a better job. Let's put it that way. If God put me in charge of the universe for 5 minutes, I would destroy everything with the best of intentions because I don't, can't possibly understand all the connections.
This also ties in. So, okay, this is a very loose connection, but
Mm,
the word faith comes forward a couple of times for me right now.
absolutely.
And I know you've been talking about this as well. And often when we hear the word faith, we think about indeed the religious context of having faith in a God. But the question that you can ask yourself in this specific context, and I know it's one of the 7 words that you use, so I'm sure you have a lot to tell about this. But faith can mean a couple of things, right? In this specific case, you might have faith that you can move on to it. And the faith then is knowing, or at least believing, that there will be a better future that there will be a better future for you,
Yeah.
right? You're putting all of this aside with the faith that you're moving on to something better, which is also the reason to bring it back to what I said earlier about marriage, what we talked about. Marrying each other, I believe, is an act of faith.
Absolutely.
Right? Because you're operating based on the faith, at least if you do it properly, and at least if you at least take the vows serious or hold them as sacred at best. You are operating based on the assumption, and thus based on faith, that you will go into the future as a wonderful unit, operating together, running in a partnership, battling the entire world together. That's faith.
Yeah, and I could actually expand upon that a little bit because I think that's a great way of talking about it. I was talking about forgiving God. To me, that is essentially equivalent to having faith.
Mhm.
And it's very much the faith you're describing, the faith that, things will get better, or more generally, the faith that, yeah, for all of this pain, life is somehow livable, and we are equipped with ways of feeling better, even if I can't figure out how the hell I'm going to do that now. But we are equipped with ways of doing that. That's what I mean by faith. There's a fundamental rightness to this whole reality business.
Mhm.
And I would expand that a little bit when you're talking about, what is the faith that you're expressing in terms of marriage? It's that faith, in addition to all the stuff about, yes, it's us together, and that feels good. There's also a piece of it that I think is associated with what would I call it? A little bit of humility, some respect for the fact that an institution that's been around in one form or
Mhm.
another in pretty much any
Mhm.
culture that any anthropologist has ever studied must have something to it.
Mhm.
And they're not all the same. And you know the name Helen Fisher? Does that name ring a bell? She just died last year, I believe. She was an anthropologist, and I only
Mhm.
read one of her books, but I really enjoyed it. And I am spacing out the name of the book, but it was about, I think, the anatomy of love or something like that. She studied uh, dozens of different human cultures, many of which were isolated from other cultures for like thousands of years, and looked at, among other things, looked at mating. How do humans do mating? What do we do? What is this marriage business? Are we monogamous? Are we not? It's funny how she comes up with it. She said, the basic, if you look at what beings actually do with respect to monogamy, what we practice is serial monogamy with clandestine adultery. So, in other words, it's not like everybody cheats. No, we don't. I mean, a lot of people do, it turns out, but not everybody does. But as a species, our method, overall cultures, they all seem to have ways of doing this. Serial monogamy, in other words, you basically, most cultures try to stay with the person they have kids with. And there's all kinds of good evolutionary reasons she cites why that is true. And clandestine adultery implying, yeah, there's adultery, but they always keep it secret. Now, there's some cultures, it's interesting you said, some people could just sort of, would think, oh, yeah, I wouldn't stand for it if there's any infidelity. There's some cultures where it's frowned upon, but it's not that bad. It's sort of expected. And then there's other cultures where it is like fatal, it's like sometimes literally so because people get violent. So it varies a lot how people do it. But the point, getting back to the point, the fact that there is an institution like that, it's easy for us. And of course, it's easier, I think, when you're younger, even than when you're older. But I remember being younger, there can be a kind of arrogance where we feel like, well, we know better than all those old folks who came up with all this old stuff. And I'm thinking, probably not. It's not that, I don't believe in accepting tradition as sacrosanct and don't ever change anything and don't ever question anything. I don't believe that at all. I do believe, I guess in that sense, I'm a sort of small c conservative, in that old sense. I'm like, if something has existed for thousands of years, there's probably something to it, at least assume that for starters. So marriage is like that. There's a piece of faith in that as well. It's like, I don't fully understand what this is about. I don't know exactly what it's going to feel like, but there must be something to it because everybody's been doing it for a long time.
This kind of ties into what we said earlier when we were talking about the general idea that we see a whole lot of bad marriage around us, but that still somehow we uphold this romantic ideal in our mind that is marriage. And maybe it is so that all humans, or at least most humans, inherently have a faith that tells them, or at least makes them feel like, or yeah, whatever you want to call it, that marriage is something beautiful and is something, let's call it a higher state, or something more valuable, or it is something, it is a level of quality, let's say, that cannot be reached just by oneself.
Yes.
Right? And it feels like, and I hope you can expand on this, but it feels like in some shape or form, whether that is religious faith or biological or nurture or whatever, but it feels like somehow that's baked into humans. But at the same time, while I'm saying that, I learned recently that, and I'm not sure if this is true, so this is just something I heard and it kind of makes sense. I heard recently that humans as a species are not necessarily monogamous species, but that we are actually polyamorous species. But that within the culture, and you used the word culture just now as well, that within our culture we have set boundaries on what is acceptable and what is not, which can be a result of faith and all sorts of different things. But apparently, biologically speaking, we are not monogamous, which kind of makes sense because, why else would cheating exist? So I'm tying a couple of things here together, but hopefully you can shed some light on that.
See, that bears on, I think, Helen Fisher's formula, that I don't know how to separate cultural from biological. I think that's probably an artificial separation. Of course, we are capable of having sex with more than a person to whom we are married or with whom we are in a supposedly monogamous relationship. Of course, people will be turned on. And, men will get erections and can have intercourse with women who will be willing to do so. And, outside the bounds of those, indeed, mostly cultural restrictions. But the fact that they are so, again, they're not universal in the sense that they always look exactly the same. There are cultures, of course, and have been many cultures that practice polygamy, but even cultures that practice polygamy, as I understand it, are mostly monogamous, just economically speaking. It's difficult for a guy to afford more than one wife, and only rich people do it. Now, again, they may be wrong in certain cultures, but, even as they say, most cultures are mostly monogamous. And that isn't, you could say, well, that's just cultural and not biological. I don't know how to, we've all seemed to have evolved that way for good reason. Similar, like there are incest taboos. Are people capable of violating incest taboos? Obviously, because they do, not nearly as often as they cheat in other ways, but every culture has them. Why would every culture have them? From an evolutionary perspective, it isn't that difficult to explain. People figured out that being drawn to one's close relative turns out badly for the species. Those people who are so wired don't end up reproducing as much over decades, over millennia, because they end up producing people who have more genetic defects. So that's why incest went out, and most species that is true. Not all, but most species that is true.
I learned something very interesting lately, and once again, I have no idea if this is true. But apparently, there's a recent studies into women specifically in this case, and apparently, it is so that the scent of men, if it's attractive to a woman, that means that they are genetically very far apart from each other.
I have heard that.
So
Yes.
it blew my mind when I heard that.
Mm-hmm.
So and they did this test. If I remember correctly, they did this test because you could ask yourself, okay, but how do you test it? Let you sniff a bunch of men and then you know.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently, what happened is they rubbed the scent of 20 men onto like t-shirts, and they gave that woman all those t-shirts, and they would ask the woman like, okay, pick out the ones that you find the most attractive smelling or the most nice smelling, and those were the men that were genetically the furthest apart. So there's a biological component into, at least into women, because men apparently don't have this, but into staying away from, family members or people that are close genetically.
Sure. And isn't evolution amazing? Because if you take something like this and extend it over many millennia, and that tendency for the people who aren't like that to end up with offspring that don't end up reproducing as much
Yeah.
gets strengthened. That's how evolution, that's how natural selection works. So the fact of that happening over and over again, it's like, and every culture, even the ones that have been isolated from others for thousands of years, these are very remote cultures that Helen Fisher was writing about, and they have those taboos as well. So is it biological? Well, sure, it is partly, because that's part of what attracts people. I mean, the cultural stuff reflects the biological as well as shapes it. That's why I say I don't even know, the separation's kind of artificial between what's cultural and what's biological.
I want to linger a little bit on the concept of marriage again. And I have two questions for you. So the first question would be just a very simple one. Like, what to you, what defines a good marriage? But let me flesh it out just a little bit, because I think a better question to ask there, and let me just make it personal.
Sure.
I'm married right now for 4 years. My wife and I have been together for 14 years, so for quite a while.
Uh-huh.
How do I know that I'm a good husband?
Well, that was pretty straightforward. I would define whether or not you're a good husband by what your wife thinks, at least as much as what you think. Do you know what I mean? If she says you're a good husband, then I guess you're a good husband. If she's giving you, you can take whatever opinion she has about that as gifts. She's telling you how to be a good husband for her, and the only person you need to be a good husband for is her. And that kind of relates to your question about what makes a good marriage. When both parties are feeling that sense that, wow, I want to be with this person. I want to make my wife feel good about who she is. And I want her to therefore feel good about having me in her life.
If you would ask my wife, for example, what is it about your partner that makes you really happy? Right? I think they can bring a couple of things forward. Like cleans up the dishes, like does the laundry, gives me a hug and a kiss every now and then. It's pretty straightforward stuff. And the opposite, I think, is also true. So when you ask her, okay, what annoys you about your partner, right? Doesn't clean up the dishes, doesn't clean up the laundry, you get the opposites.
Yeah.
But those are the obvious things. So the reason why I asked this question is not necessarily to make it a cliche, like, okay, how does a perfect marriage looks?
Yeah.
But the reason why I asked that question is a little layer deeper, because people, I think in general, don't always know what they want, or at least they can't articulate it properly. So that means that there might be some dragons laying under the sheets, let's say, or under the bed that you may not be super conscious about, but yet there is a rumbling happening in that relationship that is vague, it's unclear, it's hiding in the fog of war, let's say, but it is there and it's disruptive. So you're completely right. So if I'm asking myself the question, or I'm asking you the question, how do I know I'm a good husband? Sure, I can go to her and I can ask, like, hey, is there anything that I should improve? Is there anything that I'm doing that's bothering you? Is there anything that I can do better? Those kind of things. But then you're delving into the conscious.
Right.
Then you're delving into the things that are top of mind for her. But there might be, let's take this as deep as we can, because I might have character, certain personality traits, or certain things that I do, or certain ways that I talk, or certain particular things that are unique to me, that are negatively influencing the relationship, yet cannot be made explicit, because either they are unknown, or there's just not the words to articulate them properly. So if I ask you the question, how do I know I'm a good husband? Then the question basically that I'm asking is, how can I identify technically if there's anything that is disruptive to our relationship that are not known or they are not articulated? And not articulated is not just an inability to articulate. It might also be because, she might be a very agreeable person who doesn't, who's too, shy, let's say, or scared, let's say, to give that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's. I suppose there's two pieces to that occur to me. One, it's sort of interesting. You mentioned our podcast, Couples Therapy in 7
Yep.
Words, and I don't know if we mentioned the 7 words: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. We'd already talked about faith, but sometimes my wife will joke, or my wife and I will joke that we can really reduce it down to 4 words, which is pick the right person. So some of what you're saying, the stuff you can't articulate or someone won't articulate, kind of by definition, ain't going to get articulated. It's very difficult to know. I mean, what I would say to you, if you're wondering, oh, gee, are there any of those dragons, that I haven't I don't know about yet? Some of it you can't know unless it happens. Some of it, search your own soul. Do you feel alive? And it is interesting because there are marriages where one person feels alive and feels intimate and feels like it's great, and the other one doesn't. That can happen too. It's not always this perfect mutuality. So part of it is you have to figure that out for yourself. Is this not merely are you a good husband, but is your wife a good wife for you? Is it a good marriage? Part of it is your own gut feeling about it. And then part of it is the stuff you can do something about, which relates more to what you were saying, like if one or the other party is afraid to talk about it. That's when I talked earlier about stability and intimacy, that skill of intimacy about tolerating the anxiety of talking about it, going there and saying, I'm kind of afraid to say this, but this is what I'm worried about, or this is what's been bothering me, or this is what I'm wondering, that's the stuff that actually will help it. If you've got the right person, it'll be fine. The pick the right person thing is not trivial. It's like, yeah, there's an element of chance about that. And there's another piece to that too, which is, you marry someone with the intention that it's going to be for the long haul, until death do us part, and that's two people who are growing and changing and having experiences, and sometimes that doesn't work out the way you thought. Now, I did the math when you said you'd been together with your wife for what'd you say, like the total of 14 years?
14 years.
Yeah. So
Yep.
you were like 20 when you got together. So
Yep.
from that perspective, says the old guy over here, you were very young when you got together. I think 34 is a lot older than 20, right? I mean, if you think about your experience, you know a lot more than you did 14 years ago. Everybody does. I do. 14 years ago, I was 60, and I know a lot more now than I did when I was 60. I think that's just the human condition. So there is that possibility sometimes too, and that it's painful to see it. But, I'm not such a, the concept of soulmate, dangerous concept.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a nice idea. It's lovely. I don't mean to be totally cynical about it. I feel
think
like
it paralyzes people.
yes, exactly. I mean, I feel like my wife is, we have a lovely marriage. We love each other deeply and are really dedicated. And you mentioned people see that in our podcast. It's real. That's what they're seeing. They're seeing the chemistry. That's very real.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, the concept that says, oh, there's only one person in the whole world and they're destined to be yours, I think it's a dangerous concept, because then it leaves people feeling, first of all, it leaves people feeling hopeless if something goes wrong in that relationship. And it also is unrealistic. What I like to note is the vast majority of people out there are the wrong person for me. And I am the wrong person for the vast majority of people. But that's not because I'm bad or they're bad. That's just because, we're all the way we are, and finding the right person takes a particular combination of various things, some of which you can figure out beforehand, and some of which is very difficult. Speaking as someone who, again, my first marriage, I got married when I was 20, actually, my first marriage, and didn't know enough. And, easy to look back and say, I should have known better. I didn't. And neither did my then wife. And yeah, we made a go of it for a while, and we had kids.
But I think you can make it even worse than that, because if you believe in that whole soulmate concept, That means you believe that there is one person out there who is absolutely perfect for you.
Yes. Yes.
That means you are aiming for that one person. And that also automatically means that all the opportunity in the world, everything that you have around you, is not good enough anymore.
Yeah.
Because that means that if you have, let's say you're a super lucky guy and you have 1,000 different options for women, none of them are going to be the slightest challenge
Right.
that somebody brings with them, not good enough anymore, because now all of a sudden so-called they're not perfect anymore, they're not the one for you anymore. This ties into marriage again, and this ties into the concept of faith, I think, again, because marriage, it's not necessarily, I think, that I think the wrong way to think about it is there's one person out there who's perfect for you. I think you will find a person and make them perfect in that sense, or at least strive to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it relates to what we were talking about earlier about, there's no human being who isn't going to be annoying, somewhat, occasionally.
Yeah.
That we're all
absolutely.
human beings. We're not playing our A game all the time. That is just the human condition. And so indeed, you're going to encounter something that will seem less than perfect. And you better be okay with that. And that's what's interesting, getting back to my metaphor about the emotional bank account. When you have this huge store of goodwill and good feeling, then those little annoyances don't even amount to anything. They're just funny or charming or irrelevant. And so then they are sort of perfect for you with that. And that's sort of, then they are perfect for you. Like you said, you make them perfect for you because you grow around each other. And that is a lovely thing when it works.
One thing you said, and you glanced over it really quickly, but this one instantly sticks out to me. It's shining very bright. That if my question to you was, how do I know I'm a good husband? You asked the question, do you feel alive?
Yes.
So what came to mind is, that's also a question you can ask your partner. Do you feel alive in this relationship? That it rings very true.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just recently, in conjunction with this next book I'm writing, I came up with a little form I call the stability and intimacy assessment, which sounds way too sticky scientific than I intended to, but it addresses that. And I have a bunch of questions that are related to the way I think of stability, and a bunch of questions that are related to what I think of as intimacy. I don't ask exactly that question, but I ask a lot of questions that are pretty related to that. All of those various ways you can feel alive, feel like, wow, I can be who I am. And that feels good. I can be who I am and grow in this relationship. That's the feeling that I think that's what intimacy produces. That's what intimacy is about. When you have that, then, if you also have stability, because stability is important too, if you have that, you'll be okay. The interesting phenomenon with affairs is that affairs feel like that, but they have no stability.
Right, yeah.
Affairs often, when somebody's starved for intimacy, then they get it from someone and it feels like, oh my God, this is what I've been so thirsty for all of these years or whatever. They have that sense of, I would call it pseudo intimacy because it never lasts, but because it's so unstable, if they're having to keep it a secret or they're deceiving partners or things like that, it tends not to last.
From an outside perspective, if you're looking at a marriage from the outside, how do you know that a marriage is fundamentally healthy, even though the couple's going through a rough time?
Yeah.
So maybe, if it's a close family member, for example, how can you tell?
That's an interesting question. How do you know if it's fundamentally healthy, even if it seems to be going through a rough time? I don't know. I mean, the general answer is you never really know what's going on in someone else's marriage. You can have some indications. I mentioned earlier, people see our podcast and say, boy, those guys look happy with each other. And I'm saying, yeah, because we are. I mean, we are. If people saw us at home, they say most of the time we're smiling at each other, not pissed off. That is, that chemistry is real, But then there's folks, and I just recently, I have lots of couples like this. I had a couple I talked to last week where they're separating actually. And one of their things they're having to deal with is they say, but everybody who knows us thinks we're the perfect couple. There's been actually infidelity going on that nobody else knows about, and that's part of what they're wrestling with, is how difficult it's going to be to shatter that image that they have of being the perfect couple. So you never know from an external perspective exactly what's going on. I'll have couples come. It's, I make a sort of wry joke about it when couples are in my office and they'll say, everybody else seems to be doing better. And I will say, no, who you just referred to, they're my next clients. So you think everybody's doing better, but it turns out not necessarily so. You just can't always tell. But the way you formulated the question is interesting because, then there are those couples that you would say, oh my God, how could they possibly be doing okay? But it turns out they are. The couples that sort of bicker a lot, they're couples who that's just their style. They bicker a lot, but they seem to be okay.
For someone who's in a relationship right now and who feels more like being a roommate to their partner, right, than actual romantic partner.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the case quite a bit nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the question that you can ask yourself, of course, is the relationship worth salvaging? Is it salvageable? But I think that should not be the first question. Maybe the first question should just be super simple and upwards aimed, let's say. So to that person who feels that their partner is more a roommate than a romantic partner, what can that person do to rekindle that connection again?
Yeah, that is precisely what I talk about when I tell people about that notion of stability versus intimacy, because that's what it's like when there's stability without intimacy. My first book was called Reigniting the Spark for that reason, actually. It was all about that. It really is centered on that concept of if you have stability without intimacy. And so I come back around to what I said earlier about the chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate the anxiety rather than avoiding it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that's what they've been avoiding it. And that's how it turns into roommates. They've been avoiding the anxiety of actually, among other things, talking about how they feel. And, I so often point out to folks, in fact, almost always I point this out to every couple, and this actually fits in the general category of faith, believe it or not. What I point out to folks, usually about right when I'm starting in the first session, my first session is quite structured. After that, it's more like improv theater. It's very free form. But the first, and improv, I actually have a section in one of my books where I talk about why do I call it improv? It's a lot like improv. Even with the comedy parts, but of
just
course,
like a good conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Just like I hope we're having now. If you're feeling alive now, it's that. That's what I try to do in sessions. Well, that phenomenon when I'm explaining about stability and intimacy in the first session, I do structure. I include that little talk about what I mean by stability and intimacy. When I'm talking about stability, I will usually say to the couple, I say, well, now that I've known you for 23 minutes, because we're old buddies, so I know everything about you, and they laugh. And I say, I can tell something about you that relates to stability. Neither one of you is batshit crazy, and they will usually smile. And I don't mean to make fun of serious mental health issues. Okay, every once in a while, I'll meet a couple where I don't say that because somebody is crazy. Somebody is having a manic episode or somebody is schizophrenic or something like that. But almost always when they're consulting me, they're not crazy. They're hurt. They're in bad shape often when they come to see me, but they're not crazy. And the reason I point that out is precisely about that statement of faith. Faith is the antidote to panic. That's why we have it on a cup. There's our whoops, there we go. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. If for people, most people are probably hearing it rather than watching it, but be kind, don't panic, and have faith is our 7 words from our podcast. That the reason I oriented that way, be kind in the sense of kinship. That's what makes you want to stay together. Well, you can't do that if you're in a panic. And faith is the antidote to panic. So my statement to people that says, basically, look, I'm starting with the assumption you're not crazy, you're not evil, and you're not stupid, which is, I just believe in general, is almost always the case with the folks I work with. Well, pretty much anybody. Most people aren't crazy, evil, or stupid. We all have our weaknesses, but fundamentally we're not. So we're basically valid to be who we are. That's a statement of faith. That's how you can tolerate anxiety. You can say, okay, well, we're valid people. We don't mean ill. We're really not out to get each other. We're not nuts. And yet we're in pain. Isn't that amazing? So we're going to have to confront that. We're going to have to face the anxiety of that, but not panic about it because we're basically valid.
Yeah.
And implicit in that is the other kind of faith we were talking about earlier. Yeah, life is livable. This together or separate, it's going to feel better than it does now. This sucks. It's going to be better. That's implicit in all of that, in the notion of faith. So that's kind of that's a very long answer to your question. Like, how do you reignite that spark? Yeah, it takes faith. Faith is your solution, which is to say, faith to tolerate the anxiety of actually entering into intimacy, which is often scary for people.
And if you take it a step further, so okay, so let's say you can operate on faith and you can try to rekindle that relationship by opening up and having that conversation and making sure that both people understand from each other what each other need. And let's say ideally they come to an understanding, right? And they rekindle that relationship and they start working on it. And it takes a while probably, but it will get better over time.
Mm-hmm.
To some degree, it strengthens the bond as well. So you might argue even that they will reach a higher point than they would have done without that. That's arguably what will happen.
Absolutely. Yes, that is the I see that a lot. That seems to me that's about the only way they're going to recover.
Right, yeah.
Is if they actually get stronger than, I think I mentioned that before. They get stronger than they were before. And they're grateful.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier, they're grateful for the crisis. I had a woman turn to her husband in what was our last session because they were leaving town. And she said, "Hey, thanks for taking one for the team." And what she meant by that was, he asked her, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, you're the one who had to feel guilty because you were the one who did the cheating. You did the bad thing. But she didn't say thanks for cheating, but she said, "Thanks for precipitating the crisis. We needed one. Look how much better off we are now." And that was gratitude.
Okay. There's a couple of things that are coming together for me right now. You mentioned that previous conversation that you listened to with the philosopher
Yes.
podcast.
Mm-hmm.
In that podcast, the idea of heaven and hell were discussed, good and evil were discussed, but also one of the notions that came forward is in order to reach heaven, you need to go through hell first. So in order to become a better human, in order to get a stronger relationship, you need to, within the context of this conversation, you need to encounter challenges first, right? Because those are the opportunities, those provide the resources to build your marriage into something stronger than it is right now. And to me, so I'm thinking to myself how far you can stretch that. And let me tie that together with something that you said earlier. It seems that if a human physically gets hurt enough, unless he dies, right, there's a chance of full recovery and becoming stronger, right? This is the idea of you are going through martial arts training, you're getting beaten up, so you're hurting in the short term, but you're getting stronger and more capable over time.
So it sounds like Nietzsche,
right? So,
right? What doesn't kill us makes us strong. That concept.
Right. Yeah. It's that idea. Yeah. So I think you can tie those things together. Right? In order to reach heaven, you have to go through hell. In order to get a better relationship, you have to first run into challenges. All those things click into each other. But earlier you said that you have seen that couples in a relationship, they reach something higher than what they were before with infidelity within this context. And then I have a question, and let me put it to you in the form of numbers, because that's how I'm seeing it in my mind right now. If we consider 0 to be a terrible relationship, and if we consider 100 to be a perfect relationship, what it sounds like to me is that before the event of infidelity happened, you might operate on 50. Right? Infidelity brings you down to 25, but because you're not 0, the relationship doesn't die. So after working on it, you might go up to 60, but you will never reach 100. That's in my mind how it works, because that trust is not there, right? Yeah. Because the moment you figure out that somebody cheated on you, it means they can fundamentally not be trusted because they broke one of the most sacred things out there, my personal opinion. So within that context, I understand that if you are operating on a 50 as a baseline, you can go to 60, right? But I think you are capped over there. I think you can never go to 100. So is that also how you look at it? Is that also how you look at it?
I guess what I would invoke there is, it's not just one dimension. Do you know what I mean? It's not, I wouldn't just evaluate the marriage on that one dimension. The point you mentioned, I have certainly seen that, and I believe it's true. I've worked with many couples that have recovered from infidelity, but nevertheless, one or the other, usually either one actually, the one who cheated or the one who was cheated on, yearn for the time or remember the time fondly before they had that trust breach. That's true. You can never have the sense anymore that this person would never cheat on you because they did. That's true. I do often point out, however, that anybody who thinks that they could never be cheated on, again, this is separate from who they happen to be married to, that's always wrong. Do you know what I mean? And I've said to my wife, like, if I ever cheat on you, take me to get me a neurologist because I must have a brain tumor because I can't believe I would do that. I really don't think I would. I have no intention. I never have, in either of my marriages. I never cheated. But it doesn't mean it's impossible. Do you know what I mean? That weird circumstances arise and weird thoughts arise and who knows what somebody's going to do. So the idea that would say we had perfect trust before, that was never that, people are grateful for recognizing, oh, silly me to think I could never be hurt this bad because I am hurt this bad. But look at me now that I've recovered from it. So on the dimension you described, yes, you could say, well, you're never going to look at each other like you could never hurt me like that. That's true. They'll never get to 100 there. On the other hand, they have experienced something that couples that aren't presented with that challenge never have a chance to test, which is what would happen if there's a huge breach? Could we actually find each other again? That's an experience that has value in itself. People, again, put it in the context of trauma because it's just another kind of trauma. People who've recovered from horrible traumas, again, never had anybody say, well, yeah, I'm glad I was sexually abused because, boy, look what I learned. I have had many people say, they've never said, I'm glad I was sexually abused. They will say, I know stuff from having gone through this. I have an understanding of other people I wouldn't have had if I hadn't gone through that. And I'm grateful for that. So in that sense, they're better off. Now, don't get me wrong. I never prescribe infidelity as a way of improving a relationship. Not a good plan. Never.
No, but the argument that you're making makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Even though it's not an optimal situation, you could say.
Yeah.
That situation, suboptimal as it may be, provides the lessons that you can do something with.
Yes, and
that have their value to some degree.
Yeah, and a lot of times people hadn't learned those. You say sort of every relationship is going to go through what it goes through. I will note, and it's one of the advantages of being the second marriage. And second marriages don't always work well. Of course, the statistics are actually worse than on first marriages, although I have my little statistical explanation for why I think that's true. But leaving that aside, one of the advantages is you learn stuff by going through a marriage that doesn't work. And same thing, a couple that stays together through infidelity has learned something that they wouldn't have learned otherwise. And again, they're often grateful for that knowledge. It's experiential knowledge. It's not just I've learned some stuff that I can now write down. It's like, wow, I've just survived something I wouldn't think I could survive. Isn't life interesting? And they appreciate it. And then one of the side benefits of that is empathy for other people in similar situations. And people will often say that. It's like, I used to be so judgmental of people who would stay with someone who cheated. I'm not judgmental anymore now that I'm staying with someone who cheated. It's like, wow, I realize it's more complicated. And I think that's wisdom. That's hard-won wisdom. And I appreciate that. And I think often people who go through it appreciate it.
Yeah, there's also, it's a couple of things. There's a lot of humility in there, because the humility in there is realizing that you don't know everything, right? Based on which normally you would have the assumptions. Like if you, one of the assumptions might be something along the lines of, if you are the kind of person that gets cheated on, either you're attracting the wrong kind of person, or another assumption might be you are not giving your partner the proper attention, and that's why he did or she did what he or she did. Assumptions like that. And whether they have merit or not, or whether they're half true or not at all, if you go through something like that and you understand the lesson that it's giving you, there's a humility in there, because basically you're saying, okay, my worldview is fundamentally incomplete, and there is new jigsaw puzzle piece right now that I can click in my mind, and that makes me see the entire landscape better if I allow myself to do that. And that's humility, I think.
That's a great way of saying it. It is humility. And then, people resist that, again, not because they're not humble enough, but because it's a scary thing to do. To question some basic assumptions you've had, it feels very unstable. It's like, well, now what do I believe? It's the same thing we were saying about when somebody's cheated. Now, what else, what else don't I know? There's that, but it's a similar thing when you question your own values. It's like, I thought I knew this, and now I'm discovering I don't. And that's really scary. What else do I have to question about my closely held beliefs? So
Yeah.
that it is not for it's humility. And oddly enough, it takes a lot of courage to have that kind of humility.
And to be honest, it's so much more fun to have that humility and to make the realization that you don't know anything.
Yeah,
Right? There's a whole lot to learn out there.
So that second book I mentioned, where this has a snarky title, it's not about communication. Why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong. That was my second book. I love that title, and the reason that
I know you do. In every podcast, you tell how snarky it is.
I love how snarky
you
that
always
title is.
mention it.
I always mention that, and of course, and I always mention this fact too. If you've seen some of my podcasts, I point out that that snarky subtitle, where everything you know about couples therapy is wrong, applies to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong too. Of course, you could make that full circle, including the fact that it's not about communication. Like, of course it's about communication. Well, damn it, no, it isn't. There's truth in my assertion. It's not about communication. It really relates, oddly enough. Much of that book, 2 chapters of that book, is about the difference between ideas and ideology. And it's all about this, what we were just talking about, that sense that I know I know this is true. No, if I actually get a dose of humility from some bad experience, it's like, shit, I thought I knew what was true. And now I'm realizing I sort of know what's sort of true, but it sometimes isn't, like, okay, now those good ideas are still there, but they're not ideological. I don't have to defend the ideas. I can just say, well, I still think monogamy is a good idea. Don't get me wrong. Very good idea. It's just that the idea that would say any violation of monogamy means a person is evil. No, I don't think that's true. Any violation of monogamy means a person has done something wrong. I agree with that statement, but no, good people can do bad shit. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying, yeah, that's what happens.
There's one question I need to ask, and especially within the context, and especially given what you focus on, what you've spent the last 3 decades on. And this is a continuation of the question, rekindling that connection, right, with the other person. When is the right time to consider relationship therapy? When should that moment come? How do you know it's there?
No, it's a great question. In fact, the second question, the first question I ask folks routinely is, how will you know if this is helping? I want to focus them right from the get-go on, evaluating, does this seem to be helping you? And what does help look like? And people don't often know that, and it changes. And so the second question I usually ask is, why are you doing this now as opposed to, 6 months ago or 6 months from now? Was there some precipitating event?
Mm-hmm.
So I ask that because that's usually, again, this is like the second question I ask. That's usually when the story comes out about infidelity, if there's been infidelity. That's usually when they'll say,
something big happened.
Yeah, something big happened. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I just found out that they were cheating on me. Okay, that's where that happens. So that, of course, that's usually what brings people. In other words, some big event, they're not asking anymore, should we do this? And very, very often part of the story is one or the other, usually the woman, not always, but usually the woman is saying, yeah, I've been saying we should get therapy for the last 5 years, but he's been resistant. Guys tend to be resistant. We have reasons for being resistant. I have a video and actually a chapter in one of my booklets, and it's going to be a chapter in the next book I'm writing too, called How to Get Your Reluctant Guy to Go to Therapy. What will help someone go to therapy who's been resisting it? And I say guy because it's almost always a man that's resisting and almost always a woman that wants it. I know I've known exceptions, but that's usually the case. And there's and to make a long story short about that, the reason what I suggest to the women trying to convince the guy to go is she's not going to get anywhere with him until she realizes that his fears are well-founded. She needs to validate his fears. She needs to understand he's afraid for good reason. He's afraid that the therapist will side with her, which many therapists do. He's afraid that he's seen people go to therapy and then break up, and he doesn't want to lose you. And, she's thinking he won't go because he doesn't care enough. And actually, in almost all cases, it's not that he doesn't care enough, it's that he's terrified. He won't go because he's afraid to lose her. He's afraid that you go to therapy and, the therapist's going to basically say to the woman or imply to the woman, why are you with a jerk like that? And she's going to dump him. So, and those are well-founded fears. Those things can happen. They do happen sometimes. And so he's not crazy for thinking that. And if she actually can validate it, then maybe they can have a conversation. Because then he might say, okay, good. So at least you know what I'm afraid of here. But I understand we've been having a lot of problems and I don't want to lose you. So maybe we should try it. You know what I mean? That's what'll often get him to consider it. But your question about how do you know when to do that? I don't know. Usually there's fear of doing it. Women are sometimes afraid too. There's fear of it. And when you're miserable enough and you haven't, and the stuff you tried hasn't worked, that's usually when people will bring in someone else. They'll say, well, we don't know if this is going to help, but we've tried everything else, or everything else we can think of. We seem to need this, so let's try it. So, I could say, well, let me tell you what I don't say, because occasionally I'll meet folks that say, oh, we think we should be in couples therapy all the time. Maybe not every week, but that any couple should always have a therapist and they should always go there, 6 times a year or something. I don't tend to believe that. I don't think I like the family doctor model more. It's like, no, if something's wrong and, you need some help with it, go ask for help. And then when things are better, you don't need the help anymore. And then come back if you need help. I tend to think of it very pragmatically that way.
This is a tough one. This is a tough question that I threw at you, because if I would ask myself the question, a couple of things come to mind, and I would say, okay, one of the most powerful questions I think that you've given so far, at least in my personal opinion, the one that absolutely shines bright above everything else, is that question: do you feel alive?
Yeah.
And you can either ask yourself the question or you can ask your partner that question. And I think that within this context, the answer to that question will be no, you don't feel alive, right? Because that rekindling is not there, because else you wouldn't be thinking about a relationship therapist.
Yeah.
So you don't feel alive right now. There's something bothering you. But then the faith comes forward again. So if you don't feel alive right now, would you like to feel alive with this person?
Yes, great point.
And I think the answer to that question, is a faith-based question, a faith-based answer.
Even to think that it could get better is faith-based. That's a statement of faith.
Yep.
So you have to take that step. You have to be willing to say, I think this can be better. And then, okay, next step is, well, gee, maybe inviting one of these therapy people in can help it be better. And indeed, you're absolutely right. It is an act of faith to do that. And if you don't have that faith, well, kind of by definition, you're not going to do that. And so people will either just stay miserable or eventually break up because they can't stand it anymore. And so, yes, you're absolutely right to reach out for help, not knowing if it will help. But that is a statement that says maybe we can feel better.
Yeah.
Maybe we can have this relationship be that we do both feel alive in it. That works better when they've had some history of feeling that way. I've occasionally met a couple where they never had that history, and that's a lot harder. It's not rekindling the spark; it's kindling it for the first time, because they got together and they never really had that much of an intimate connection, but they thought it was a good idea, so they got married. I've met couples like that. Not usually, but I have met couples like that. So they don't even have the history that said, well, we at least had the honeymoon period and then things kind of went down. They were saying, no, we never really had much of a connection. That's a harder one to kindle.
Yeah, because there's no baseline.
Yeah. Now, what they have going for them sometimes, because sometimes it'll be after years, they have kids, they have a life, they built years together. What they do have is that shared history that can feel sacred. That can feel like, well, yeah, we never had, we didn't have great sex. We didn't have that great sort of erotic spark between us, but we have a shared history here, and that's meaningful, and I respect that.
I think I have 2 more questions for you. So with all the experience that you have working with couples and working with people in general, and with everything that you have seen, what does a human relationship fundamentally represent to you?
Wow, what an interesting question. Huh. What does a human relationship fundamentally represent to me? I think it's inherent in being human that we want that being in relationship isn't like an added on extra. It's fundamental to who we are. The thing that needs explaining is someone who doesn't want to be in an intimate relationship, not someone who does. And again, I'm not, there are folks who just prefer to be alone. There are very few such folks who really prefer to be alone, but they do exist. But I think for most of us, it is so inherent in our feeling alive, in our feeling meaningful, that we are in intimate relationship with others. I don't just mean sexually. Even people who aren't involved sexually or don't want to be involved sexually need intimate connection with other human beings. So to me, that's what it represents. It's like, no, it's just fundamental to being human that we want that. I don't, to me, that doesn't require explanation. It's built in. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. Humans are social creatures, so being isolated for the rest of your life without having anybody to spar with and without having anybody to share both the good and the bad with, that seems counterintuitive. It seems anti-human pretty much,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Because we again are social creatures. So I think maybe to tie it into the concept of marriage, I think marriage could be considered like the ultimate ideal of that idea,
Mhm.
right? The ultimate ideal of having that human connection. That is marriage.
Yeah. It's an expression of that with all of the cultural, shaping of that and historical and evolutionary and all of that together. It's what we do. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And we don't always do it well, but we don't always do anything well. Do you know what I mean? It's like
yeah.
it goes well, it doesn't
We're
go
all very,
well. Yeah.
we're all knowing every now and then.
Yeah. Yes. That is. If people take away, yeah, you said you took away. It's interesting what you took away from what I said because now I'm going to start saying that more. That sense of being alive. That really got you. But just that concept that we're all annoying. That's sort of that is the truth that I'm going around spreading. It's like, hey, we're all annoying, and so and people usually smile at that concept because they recognize, okay, maybe you can relax a little at the annoyances because it's kind of inevitable.
Well, let me tell you the reason. Maybe this is interesting to you. Let me tell you the reason why it stood so much out to me. Because what I've heard a little while ago, and which, okay. So one of the questions I could ask you could be the question: what do people in a relationship not ask each other
Mm.
enough? And the reason why I didn't bring that question forward right now, it was prepared. The context didn't allow it. But the reason why that question I think is very fundamentally important is because up until this conversation, my personal answer would be, "Are you
Mhm.
happy?"
Yeah.
Right? Considering actually not looking at yourself for a little bit, but considering actually, okay, is the person that I'm with actually fundamentally happy? Right? That is a fundamental question. And to me, in my mind, that was the most brilliant question you can ask someone to gauge if they are happy with this relationship. But the reason why yours stood out so much is because I think that's a better
Mm.
version. I think
Yeah.
the version, do you feel alive in this relationship, is actually a way better question.
Yeah, I do too, although that's rather self-serving of me, isn't it? But yeah, I do too. Yeah, it's interesting because, yeah, happy is one of those. Happy is really interesting culturally. Different cultures have a different notion of what that even means. But
Mhm.
it's also, it's a feeling that comes and goes in various ways. And I want to feel alive in my relationship, even in times of deep grief or deep sadness or deep,
Yeah.
deep fear. We
Mhm.
actually mentioned this on one of our podcasts a while ago. One of my sons had a horrible rock climbing accident not quite a year ago, and he's recovering, but it's a very long haul. Really bad. A rock fell off. He was doing everything safely, but this freak accident, a rock came from above and hit him in the head, and so he has a really bad traumatic brain injury, and he's amazing. He's still alive. I'm going to get emotional thinking about it, but to go through that with my wife, I was so grateful, and that wasn't about being happy, but that was about being able to feel. Do you know? The fact that I could go through that with my wife and we could cry together and we could be afraid together and we could, that was, that felt so alive. That feels so alive. We can share that. It's not just about sharing happiness. Of course, what I wish for everybody is mostly happiness. It should always be happiness, but
Yeah.
but even that's included too. So yeah, the question, are you happy in this relationship? Again, yeah, I like it to broaden it. And of course, are you happy is a good question too. It's like, well, yeah, you want to both feel like, or are you satisfied? That's another, do you feel like you're in the right relationship? But to me, that's the same question. Do you feel alive in this relationship? Do you feel like it brings out who you are in all the right ways? And people will often say that to each other too. It's like, you bring out the part of me, what one of the many ways I love my wife is that she seems to love in me the parts of me I like. You know what I mean? She likes the right parts of me, because if somebody liked me for the parts of me I don't like, it would be kind of difficult, you know. But and vice versa, She feels valued and I feel valued. That's that feeling of being alive again. It's like, yeah, for all of the ways that God knows I'm annoying, and she knows I'm annoying, she nevertheless seems to value who I am, and that feels like, oh, good, my being who I am is consistent with being in this relationship, not in spite of it. That's another way of saying, are you feeling alive?
Being able to sit in the mud together.
Yeah.
That's something that came forward in that episode with Edison Greco. Being able to not just, in my case, there was a problem that I was having, that I started realizing in that conversation, that if there's something sad happening, that I would put my working gloves on.
Yeah, I remember that she talked about that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but she mentioned, and very rightfully so, and I'm very happy and very grateful that she did. First of all, the better option is not to just say this is what I'm going to do, but to give options like, hey, what do you need? I can do these things for you.
Yes.
But that the value of just sitting in the mud with someone.
I think she mentioned a friend of hers had had a death in the family, and what she needed was for Allison to just sit and hold her hand and cry with her.
Exactly.
And that was hard for her, and I really relate to that. But that's yeah. And of course, again, I think there's a gendered piece to that too. And she may have mentioned that too. Guys as a group, men as a group will tend to go to fix it as opposed to sit with it.
Yeah.
And often what women are looking for is, and men too, for that matter, are looking for, no, I just want you to sit with me with this. I don't need you to make me dinner right now. I need to sit with this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bruce, is there anything that we didn't talk about today that we should have? Or any question that you wish I would have asked?
Not occurring to me. This has been delightful. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you did. I hope your listeners did too. I really enjoyed it. It's always, well, it feels alive, a conversation that just goes I think I said actually when you had your form or whatever to fill out or questions you asked about, why do you want to be on this podcast? And I think I mentioned, I want to be on your podcast because what you seem to do when I sampled your podcast is you just go where it goes. You're not just asking a bunch of canned questions and, thank you very much. You're engaging, and I really enjoy that. I enjoy conversations where we're actually engaged. So I like doing couples therapy. I feel very engaged with the folks that I work with.
It's where that calling is coming from. Wonderful. Bruce, thank you so much for coming on. And that has been an absolute pleasure walking through this with you, the dynamics of relationships, how marriages work, what the value of faith is. A lot to think about. This is, again, one of those conversations. I'm very sure that if I listen back to it, there's I probably just picked up 20% of what you just said in this conversation. And that's the beauty of it. It's deep. There's a lot of wisdom in it. There's a lot of practical, useful information in it as well. There's 3 steps, for example, of how people can deal with certain things. I love it. It's absolutely wonderful. If people are interested in your work, where can they find you?
Easiest way is just go to my website, which is brucechalmer.com. So if they spell my name right, they'll get it. BruceChalmer, brucechalmer.com. That has information about my practice, my books, links to the podcast that Judy Alexander, my wife, and I do together, and anything else about me. I got a bunch of videos and stuff like that on there as well.
Amazing. I'll put it down in the show notes below, so everybody who's interested can find it there. Bruce, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.